Hey, welcome everybody to Blueprint Week number 5, where we're talking about serving the city. One of the things that's true about basically all groups of humans of any kind is we like to be with ourselves. We don't really like to be around different groups of people. We like to control our environment, know who we're going to be around, and be kind of safe and happy with that. The problem with that is that it actually puts us into places where we can't actually love our whole city and we can't reach the whole world. In fact, there's been a lot of talk about how over the last 50 years people have been moving back to cities and how people are living in these really diverse neighborhoods and so on. But that's actually really not true. Over that 50 years, even more people have moved to the suburbs, and cities have counted those as part of the cities. But the real phenomenon is people are getting more into smaller neighborhoods, more out into the suburbs where they can control their environments. People are actually living their lives more separated than ever before. But what Jesus says to us is not that we should be a light to our household or our sub-neighborhood, but listen to what he says in Matthew 5:13-16. He says, "You, that is the church, are the salt of the earth, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." So if you listen to that passage, he says, you are the salt of the whole earth. You are the light of the whole world. If you light a lamp in a house, you put it up so that everyone in the house can see its light. And that when you do good deeds, you do it so that all of mankind will glorify your Father in heaven. The focus of Jesus is that we're supposed to be here for everyone. We're supposed to love the whole city. We're supposed to serve the whole city. When people think about Christian faith in relationship to the Old Testament and the people of God, oftentimes the way they think is in terms of the Jewish people in the kingdom of Israel, that they had a home, they had a place where they lived. They were basically one people. They were basically one race. But when the New Testament church began and the New Testament Christians had to think of themselves in a relationship to the Old Testament people of God, they didn't tend to think of themselves in relationship to being in Israel and being stationary and being at peace and being at home. The New Testament Christians understood that as the state of heaven. What they understood our present state to be was the state of exile. Listen to the first verses of the book of 1 Peter. He says, "To God's church scattered throughout," and then he goes on, "the nations." The word scattered is the word diaspora. You may have heard that in terms of like how people refer to refugees. That is, that they're people that have been pushed out of their homeland and they're scattered in another homeland. And what Peter was trying to help them recognize was there was a time in all of Jewish history in which the Jewish people were not in their homeland. They were not experiencing the peace and the rest that God promised them. They were somewhere else. They were stuck among another people. They were dispersed among foreigners, and they had to live for God among foreigners. And when Peter wrote to the Christians in Rome and in Turkey and in these places, that's what they were. They were the people of God that didn't have their own country, dispersed among foreigners. We'll talk about the why of that in the biggest possible picture next week, when we talk about how the gospel is meant to go out to reach the whole world. But when you think about it in those terms, he's pointing back to a very specific episode. It's an episode that's talked about in the book of Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 29, the people of God have actually been sent out of Israel into the country of Babylon as diaspora, as exiles. And they're sitting on the other side of the river from the city of Babylon, and they're deciding whether or not to actually go into the city and live there. And there's a false prophet named Hananiah that says, listen, in 2 years, we're going to be back in Israel. God is going to break the back of Babylon. We're going to be free. We're going to go back home, and we're going to be fine. So let's stay out here and be our own people. And so God sends a letter through the prophet Jeremiah, and he says, that's actually not true at all. He says, the exile that you're experiencing, it's going to be 70 years. Your grandchildren are going to come back to Israel. So what you need to do is you need to make a home among these foreigners and live for God in the secular city. That's what you need to do. And notice that's what Peter is saying the church is. So listen to this passage from Jeremiah 29 verses 14, and it'll end with the famous verse 11. "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. That is literally exactly the same for the New Testament church. We are the people of God in exile in a land that He's given, that we're going to be here. And a day is going to come when He will fulfill His gracious promise to us, and He will give us a final and ultimate homeland where we will no longer be in exile among foreigners. We will be only the people of God together with God as our King. That's called heaven. That's not right now. What we're doing right now is we're living in Babylon. There's two things He tells His people to do when you're living as the people of God within the secular city. The first is He says, as a people, increase, don't decrease. It's very easy to live in a culture that you can feel like is against everything the Bible teaches, and to say, who would want to bring a child into this world? Do I really want to build a family? Do we really want to build into the church? There's this sense in which people want to hunker down and not grow. And He says, no, you need to get married and have children and build a society. As the people of God, He's saying, as the Jews, He said, increase as a people, don't decrease. And that's something we have to take seriously. We have to build into our families. We should have and raise Christian children. We should build into the church. We should increase and not decrease, even while we're in this secular city. But then the second thing He says, also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have sent you in exile. He takes personal credit for sending them there. And He said, here's the reason. Because if that city does well, you're going to do well. I have tied your fate and their fate together. And we need to understand that in God's divine providence, He has intentionally tied the fate of the church in Madison to the city of Madison, the people of Wisconsin to the state of Wisconsin, the people of the United States to the nation of the United States. And just because they won't do everything the way we tell them to, doesn't mean that that stops. We are together with them. Our fates are bound together, and that's something God has done intentionally by sending us as scattered people among them. So it is our job to serve them sacrificially, to pray for the whole city, to be a blessing to the whole city, to serve the whole city, to love the whole city, to sacrifice for the whole city. That's what we're here to do. We're not here to wait until the city goes to hell so that we can go to heaven. God explicitly told us that is not our job. Our job is to love the city. Now, when you think about that, how are we supposed to be, in the words of Matthew 5, supposed to be light and to be salt? We're supposed to be salt. We're supposed to be a retardant to evil. And we're supposed to be light. We're supposed to be able to shine the way forward. There's three things that we have to remember that we have to do day in and day out to really live out what it means to serve the city. The first is that we need to recognize and embrace the idea that sacrificial service is the price of influence. Okay? Sacrificial service is the price of influence. If we want to have influence in the lives of other people for the gospel, for the truth, for good, for whatever, the cost of that is always going to be serving them sacrificially. It's going to cost us to help them. That's the only way anybody really trusts people they don't already trust. And because of that, sacrificial service is the price of influence. And do you see how Jesus knew that? In order to not just die for our sins, but also to bring us to Himself, He sacrificially served us in a dramatic way so that we would recognize we could trust Him. Because He wanted so much to redeem us, He would give so much for us, and so then we trust Him. That's how it always works. Sacrificial service is the price of influence. The second is that heart change requires contact. I joke about the idea that before you have a kid, it seems like a terrible idea. But a lot of parents, after they have kids, they like having kids. It's partly because after you have kids, you actually meet the kid. The fact is that love and empathy and the things that make life passionate and powerful come from being in contact with people. right? It comes from meeting the people we're going to serve and being with them and understanding their lives and understanding why they have these problems and so on. If we stay separated from them, what happens is they become a caricature to us. So the poor become just poor. But they're all people with stories. They have the characteristic of being poor, but they're a lot more than that. But to us, they'll just be the poor, right? People who are in jail, they're just the criminals, the felons, the incarcerated. Old people are the old people. I mean, they're all just what they are. They're that one thing. They're this little kid caricature, and we're not going to care about them. It's like a kid before they're born. They're just the person who's going to interrupt our sleep and chew up all our income, right? But when you have a kid and you have a relationship, it matters. For you and I to be changed into truly, fully loving people like Jesus is, we have to have contact with people in the city. We can't just have all Christian friends and be at the church. High Point is here to help you live the Christian life, not be your life. Heart change requires contact. And the third thing is that obedience is the price of understanding. There are so many truths in the Christian faith that you will never learn until you obey God and then you experience their truth. There are some truths that are cognitive, that are like, this is true, and you can go, oh, or I'm not sure that's true, and you can make an argument, and you can work through the argument and figure out if it's right. There are some things that relate to human beings that because we don't really understand human beings, they sound like nonsense. And it's not until we do them in the real world with real humans, us being a real human, and then something happens and then we understand it. My favorite verse where this is taught in the scriptures is in John 7, verses 16 to 17. This is what Jesus says. Jesus answered, "My teaching is not my own. It comes from him who sent me. If anyone chooses to do God's will, he will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own." Do you see the idea there? He says, what I'm teaching you, it's not mine, it's from God. And if you do it, then you'll find out whether or not I'm teaching something on my own or whether it's from God. That is, in the doing, you find out its truthfulness. There are enormous truths, most of them having to do with living out the Christian life and how it actually works when you're in it, that you cannot learn through logic. You cannot even learn just by reading the Bible. You won't really understand them until you do them. So there's three spiritual realities to remember if we're going to increase in the city and not decrease in it, and if we're going to live for the good of the whole city and to seek its peace and prosperity. We have to remember that sacrificial service is the price of influence. Heart change requires contact, and obedience is the price of understanding. You've got to do battle with those three ideas, and that's what the discussion time is for. So bust out your books to the question page and come up with some questions and try to have a good discussion about what it means for us to live as most of us suburban people in a modern secular city in a way where we're pouring ourselves out for the peace and prosperity of the whole city, where we're serving the city. Have fun.